Flames like tinder by post-war years here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to Professor Noam Chomsky, I interviewed him at the Harvard Memorial Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I began by asking him for his assessment of President Obama's foreign policy.
When Obama came into office, or when he was elected, one high Bush official, I think it was Condoleezza Rice, predicted that Obama's foreign policy would be a continuation of Bush's second term. The first and second term of Bush were quite different. I mean, the first term was, aggressive, arrogant, kicking the world in the face, even allies. And it had such a negative effect, this is an action as well as manner, that U.S. prestige in the world sank to the lowest point it's ever been. Now, that was really harmful to the interests of those who actually set foreign policy, business world, corporate interests, state planners, and so on. So there's a lot of criticism of Bush right from the mainstream in the first term. Well, the second term was somewhat different. For one thing, some of the most extreme figures were kicked out. Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, a couple of others were sent off to pasture. They couldn't get rid of Cheney because he was the administration, so can't dismantle it. But a lot of the others went, and the policy shifted more towards the norm, to the more or less centrist norm. And little talk about negotiations, less aggression and so on, and a more polite attitude toward allies, so that it was more acceptable. Fundamentally, it didn't change, but it was more acceptable. And this prediction was that that's what Obama would do. And I think that's pretty much what happened. In fact, there's a pretty interesting characterization of this, which sort of captures it, I think, pretty well. It's anachronistic, but I think it applies. Back in 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world really was coming, dangerously close to a nuclear war, which would have been sort of the end. Most dangerous moment in history, Arthur Schlesinger called it, Kennedy's advisor. Right at the peak of the missile crisis, U.S. planners were considering measures which they knew might destroy Europe, and in fact, in particular, Britain. So, and they were kind of playing out these scenarios which led to the destruction of Britain, but they weren't, and taking them very seriously. In fact, they're taking the steps towards them. But they didn't let Britain know. Britain is supposed to have a special relationship with the United States, but the British were pretty upset. They couldn't find out what was going on. The Prime Minister, Macmillan, all they could find out was what British intelligence was picking up. So here they're the best and the brightest. They're making plans that might well lead to the destruction of Britain, but they're not telling them. At that point, a senior advisor, I think it was probably Dean Acheson of the Kennedy administration, entered the discussion, and he defined the special relationship. He said the special relationship with Britain means that Britain is our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. And the British, of course, like to hear the fashionable word. Well, that's pretty much the difference between Bush and Obama. Bush simply told him, you're our lieutenant. You do what we say or you're irrelevant. In fact, that's the word that I think Colin Powell used at the UN. Do what we say or you're irrelevant. You're just our lieutenant and forget about it. Well, they don't like to hear that. What they like to hear is that you're our partner. We love you. And then back in secret, we treat you as our lieutenant, but that's okay. And I suspect that that's the main difference.
What about the anti-war movement in the United States? You've long been a participant in it, very active in Vietnam right up until today. But where do you see it in relation to the person that many of them devoted tremendous efforts to elect?
Well, Actually, my view, which is not the standard one, is that the anti-war movement is far stronger now than it was in the 60s. In the 1960s, there was a point, 1968, 69, when there was a very strong anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. But it's worth remembering that the war in Vietnam started, an outright war started in 1962. And by then, maybe 70 or 80,000 people had already been killed under the U.S. client regime. But in 1962, Kennedy really opened outright war, sent the American Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam under South Vietnamese markings, but everybody knew. It was even reported. Authorized napalm, authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover. Started the programs which drove ultimately millions of people from the countryside into what amounted to concentration camps to try to, the words were, to protect them from the guerrillas who the government knew perfectly well they were supporting. The same kind of things you read now in Afghanistan if you bother to read the fine print about the conquest of Marja. But we had to drive them into concentration camps to protect them from the people, the guerrillas they were supporting. That's a war. It's a serious war. Protest was zero, literally. I mean, it was years before you could get any sign of protest. I mean, those of you who are old enough may remember that in Boston, liberal city, in October 1965, that's 3 years after that, hundreds of thousands of American troops rampaging the country, war spread to North Vietnam and so on. We tried to have our first public demonstration against the war on the Boston Common, usual demonstration place. It's October 1965. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. He couldn't say a word. It was broken up, violently. A lot of students marched over trying to break it up. Hundreds of state police there. The next day, the Boston Globe, most liberal paper in the country, devoted its whole front page to denouncing the demonstrators, not the ones who were breaking it up. A picture of a wounded soldier in the middle, that sort of thing. Well, that was October 1965. Hundreds of thousands of troops there, war escalating beyond. Well, finally, after years, in 1968, you got a substantial anti-war movement, 67, 68. By then, South Vietnam was gone. It was virtually destroyed. And the same was true of much of the rest of Indochina. Well, the war did go on for a long time with horrible effects, and we were unwilling to face the fact, even to report the fact. But nevertheless, the anti-war movement did have an effect very late. Or compare Iraq. There were huge protests before the war was officially launched. I mean, we now know that Blair and Bush were simply lying when they said that they were trying to work for a diplomatic settlement. They'd already started the war. Okay, that came out in the famous Downing Street memos in England. But it hadn't been officially announced. But there were huge demonstrations. And I think they had an effect. The U.S. war in Iraq was horrible enough. Probably killed about 1 million people, drove a couple of million out of the country, devastated the country, destroyed it. Horrible cultural destruction and so on. It was pretty awful. Could have been a lot worse. It's not what the U.S. did in South Vietnam. Nothing like it. No saturation bombing with B-52s, chemical warfare, and so on. And I think it was retarded by the anti-war movement. The population here had just become more civilized. That's one of those grim effects of the 1960s.
And Afghanistan.
Pardon?
And Afghanistan.
Afghanistan is an interesting case. Afghanistan was sold here as a war to retaliate, it's always called a just war, to prevent terror, retaliate against a terrorist attack. It's such a standard view that to take it apart, requires more time than I'd be allowed. But the fact of the matter is that was not the goal of the war. I mean, if the goal of the war was to isolate al-Qaeda eliminate terror, there were straightforward ways to proceed. I mean, if you go back to that time, the jihadi movement itself was highly critical of the 9/11 attack. There were fatwas coming out from the most radical clerics in, Al-Azhar University, the main theological center, denouncing al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and the terrorist attacks on Islamic, we don't want to do that, and so on. Well, if you wanted to end terror, the obvious thing to do at that point is to isolate al-Qaeda, to try to gain support.